Well, good evening, everybody. My name's Richard Day. I'm Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research here at Wrexham Glyndwr University, and it's my really great pleasure to welcome you to the university, especially as we have a number of people who've not even been in the building before, so it's really great to see new faces. So, I've worked here for some years. I'm not going to say how many years, but probably a similar number to Gareth. And what that's meant is, from time to time, I've had the privilege of chatting to him about his research. And two things came across to me. One is the level of enthusiasm that he has for this subject. And the other is just how important it is in terms of social development. And there are things I think he's going to say which I think you'll find quite surprising in terms of housing stock and housing development. So I'm not going to steal any of his thunder, but to pass over to you, Gareth, and let's hear about Victorian Workers Housing.
That's lovely. Thank you, Richard. First of all, thank you for taking some time out to come and look at some slides this evening. I think these types of houses, terraced houses, small brick terraced houses typically, there's a lot of historical context attached to these buildings, and of course we can walk past them every day and maybe not really appreciate where these types of buildings have come from. So that's the first message I'd like to sort of communicate is the historical significance of these houses, in that they raised hundreds of thousands of people out of poverty in the second half of the 19th century. And the second point I'd like to try and communicate really is that there is an argument that the Welsh did build most of Liverpool, and hopefully we'll come on to that in the slides that follow. So I'm not sure if anyone has tried to buy one of these recently, but sort of locally, I think you'd be lucky to get anything around the £100,000 mark. In the suburbs of major cities or large towns throughout the land, we might get something approaching 200,000 perhaps. Anywhere near the London suburbs, then we're approaching £1 million. But the sad irony with this, of course, is that these houses weren't intended to be so lucrative in many ways, and hopefully we'll explore some of the themes associated with that in due course. Because these houses were developed through a series of local and national pieces of legislation because things were so bad. These images come from the courts and cellar dwellings of Liverpool, notorious for their desperate poverty. And this, of course, is the environment that preceded anything like a bylaw terraced house that we are totally familiar with these days. These images, they never see. I can look at these for ages because ethereal people emerge out of the darkness. Sometimes you don't see them the first time you look at it, but when you start looking in windows and doorways, you know, these people begin to appear. And of course, these are early 20th century images, which is a period when poverty still existed on a huge scale in the large urban areas of Britain's towns and cities. So these are particularly desperate places to be. No regulation, or if there is any regulation, very little of it. Landlords have practically free rein to build what they like, to put as many people into those houses as they can. If you didn't pay your rent, you were chucked out. They were sort of dens of crime and vice in some places, and the lack of drainage, lack of good drinking water meant that epidemic disease sort of was rife in these sorts of environments. So in terms of these sorts of environments, they were still with us in the 60s and 70s. You know, there's an argument to say that some of these desperate conditions are still with us today. So in terms of the historical context of these sorts of environments, I think things are improving, you know, in the modern world, but maybe not fast enough and not necessarily everywhere are things improving. And if you know where to look, some of these properties still exist. This is the back of London Road in Liverpool, as you sort of come out of Liverpool towards the east. And these are quite important structures now, historically, for what they are. They're the last vestiges of that desperate plight for so many hundreds of thousands of the urban Victorian poor. So I have been in the roof space of one of these, actually. Even now, you know, it's a dark and depressing place. And when you look at the evolution of that over time, a lot of this property, if the grey is the built element, of course, on the white are the streetscapes, it's not surprising that the Welsh Baptists were about, the Welsh Wesleyan Methodists were about in Great Cross Hall Street, the established church, the Roman Catholic faith. This is where these faithful people felt they needed to be to try and make the best of such a difficult and desperate situation. So when you look at the densities of these places, when you look at these sort of medicine bottle shapes here, these are the courts, and the narrowing at the top is the entrance to those courts, and they would typically look like that. So no light, hardly any light, hardly any air, no water supply, no drainage, no security. You can imagine these sorts of environments being affected by crime and everything else associated with that in such a desperate area. But there is research that suggests, though, that the poorest tended to look after each other. If you needed anybody to give you their last penny, you could rely on your fellow poor people to do that. It's only when the sort of levels in that society sort of further up those levels, people more or less kept the poor at a distance. And that's quite ironic, really, in terms of if the authority's not looking after these people, then we should look after ourselves. And, you know, that's a well-established fact. So the 1841 census in Liverpool suggests that 1/5 of the population are living in these conditions. And again, another aspect of these photographs is that the locals know the photographers about, and they all come out and have a look. But these are, again, you can stare at these images for hours and still see things that you might have missed the first time. But of course, that's not just Liverpool. These things are happening to a smaller scale. Wrexham suffered similar problems. When we think about some of the local environments, not too dissimilar to the large metropoli, if that's the right word, of Liverpool, Manchester, Birmingham, Glasgow. These environments are, again, ramshackle, I suppose, uncontrolled, unregulated. It's a free-for-all for landlords. And landlords typically wouldn't necessarily have any sympathy. Rent is what they do it for, and if you couldn't pay your rent, you're chucked out. Not much charity about in that respect. And not just one person per room, of course. We're talking 7, 8, a dozen people in a room, maybe. If anyone's seen the film Angela's Ashes, then that gives you clearly an idea of what some of these environments might have been like. So really desperate circumstances with uncontrolled development. Not just light, a lack of light and a lack of ventilation, but fire spread, structural failure. It's wrong on every sort of level of by modern day standards. So these sorts of environments, breeding ground for disease, and the early Public Health Act, I think it was 1848, gave powers for an inspectorate to arrive in towns like Wrexham, and this is the report on Wrexham in general public health terms by George Clark. And I've included a bit of narrative here in the next few slides, so apologies in advance for having to read it, but the words paint so many pictures, really. The small back street courts and alleys are in the most wretched condition in regard to cleanliness. Here the eye sees filth of every description, manure of all sorts heaped up for months from pigsties, etc. gutters and drains full of putrid matter, which in some instances runs under the cottages and is not to be removed by any existing means of purification. I believe cottage property to have been on the whole property of a most valuable description to its owners, and at the time I found the poor paying rents of £3, £5 and £7 per annum for tenements that no surveyor would have ventured to value unless they had been required for a railway. In other words, the only point of valuing that property is to demolish it to build a railway. It gets better. In the course of the inspection, I received numerous complaints of the scarcity of pure water. The population of the Pentrefellin district fetch water from Bryn y Ffynnon, a remarkably clear and copious spring on the west side of York Street, next to the churchyard. The wells are tainted and the people go elsewhere for drinking water. There are in the town 148 private pumps and 4 public wells or pumps. This is interesting. The town is lighted by gas manufactured by a private company and supplied under a contract with gas inspectors appointed by the township. There are 60 public lamps lighted for 8 months in the year, emitting 5 nights at and about each full moon. There's a terrible feeling that we're going back towards that ourselves in the modern world. Thefts are very numerous, and altogether I consider the town, as regards crime and immorality, among the worst in North Wales. Superintendent Griffiths also states, with reference to crime, drunkenness among the lower classes, male and female, is very frequent and difficult to check owing to the bad state of the lodging houses. Prostitution is also complained of. Scarcely a lodging house in the town refuses to harbour for this purpose. There are about 1,400 yards of drains of all kinds. Of these, however, only 170 yards are reported as efficient or at all approaching the efficiency, so that only about 1/35th part of the town may be said to be sewered. In forming the drains to which reference has been made, the brook has been regarded as the proper receptacle for the filth of the town, and into it they discharge their contents. More on that in a moment. The sewage of one portion of the town has hitherto been discharged into the low boggy spot close to the town known as Eagles Meadow. So next time you're shopping in Eagles Meadow, here it has been customary to pen it back and either to sell it or put it upon the land, causing a most serious nuisance to this quarter of the town. The house drainage is what might be expected in a place without street sewers. In many cases there is not even a gutter. In others, the gutter flows along a covered entry into the open street. Sometimes there is a trench cut beneath the floor and covered with the loose flags or bricks of the dwelling room. The privies, where there are any, have cesspools which are usually open and without drains, so that when full, as they frequently are from rain, the diluted and most offensive filth overflows into the yards and courts, and not unfrequently into the houses. Wrexham is full of instances of such places. These cesspools and the cottage pigsties are among the chief evils of Wrexham. Not only are the privy cesspools in them very numerous, but the people are in the habit of forming very large pits on their premises and storing manure collected in the streets and elsewhere. Into these places they put straw with a view of it becoming rotten, and from the sale of the whole they derive a considerable revenue, selling the stuff at 3 shillings to 4 shillings and 6pence a tonne. Of course, this sum is gained by individuals at a great loss to the community from the consequences of the pauperism, sickness and premature death directly attributable to such filthy practices. So George Clark wasn't particularly happy about Wrexham. And when you look at the modern day plan and the location of the courts that preceded modern Wrexham, if you like, we've got a whole series of the sorts of courts that we've looked at in terms of the images of these environments dotted around the town. And the Brook Street, there you can see the brook is actually open on that plan, but you can see the dense accommodation, unregulated, uncontrolled, close to that watercourse, which of course is a recipe for disaster. So this is this is just sort of northeast of town. I can't remember, I think that might be Holt Street. More sort of very dense insanitary accommodation there. This is Eagles Meadow, and some courts down towards Mount Street. So you can see these concentrations of this very dense, unregulated accommodation is asking for trouble, because it's just evolved into that state. There's been no plan. It's been constructed, inhabited, and utilised in that respect. So when you look at all these dangerous places to live. In the early part of the 19th century, we see all these courts in Wrexham, which obviously have gone forever, thankfully. But what I want you to draw your attention to is this court up here, which is difficult to read on the OS map, which is why I put a question mark. We'll come back to that. So these are the deaths between September 1845 and October 1849. 145 deaths from epidemic disease because of the prevalence of these environments. And it's no surprise that when you start looking at the larger numbers, 12, 15, 17, that's the lowest part of town, which is where the water will gravitate to. And of course, we didn't understand the science of cholera at that stage. So we now know that cholera is a waterborne disease, and it's no coincidence that most people have died at the lowest part of the town where the brook is running through. So that sets the scene in terms of what the early 19th century environment looked like and smelt like and perhaps tasted like, I think, with some of that terminology. The solution was, in both Liverpool's context and in Wrexham's context to an extent, was an evolution of legislation. And what we're going to look at now is how improvements were made in the Liverpool context. Lots of cities and towns, London, Birmingham, had their own sort of bylaws. Some bylaws were quite standard and sort of taken off the shelf and implemented. But Liverpool, in many respects, was ahead of the game. They preceded some of the public health acts because the authorities, in an informal sense, in Liverpool, were one of the earliest governing sort of hierarchy to be able to implement change in this context. This is a typical Georgian townhouse in Duke Street in Liverpool. And when the wealthy decided to dispose of their properties and move out to the countryside, because typically they were in close proximity to the disease-ridden courts and cellars that existed in that environment, they sold up and went. And of course, landlords purchased these buildings and, to gain even more income, accommodated hundreds of people in these buildings. And not only that, they filled in what small yard there was at the back of these townhouses with extra accommodation. So they're absolutely cramming these people in and purely for profit, because it's not regulated and they can do it. And what's interesting, any new development then, subsequent to that, took on the shape of those yard infill type developments. So it became the norm in the 1820s, 1830s, to actually build such dense accommodation from scratch. But of course, the local, the great and the good locally, in terms of trying to change things and to improve conditions, started to introduce some sort of regulation to be able to try and control these environments a bit better. The Liverpool Building Act of 1842 insisted that these courts have to be a minimum of 15 feet wide. So what does that do? Well, it increases the light, it increases the fresh air. So by moving the facades of buildings further apart from each other, that's an improvement, at least. Not huge at this context, but an improvement nonetheless. The Liverpool Sanitary Act introduced a number of further requirements. From this point, those narrow entrances were banned. So the entrance to the court had to be the same width as the rest of the court, that minimum of 15 feet. You could only have 8 houses in any one court. So we see in these instances 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, with that full width entrance. And if you wanted any more houses than that, you had to add another foot either side. So these are very rudimentary dimensional regulations, which is now actually starting to spread these very dense buildings further apart from each other. And pedestrian ways have to be 30 feet wide. So if it's a thoroughfare, then you've got a much wider distance between one building and the building opposite. Then the Liverpool Sanitary Amendment Act 1864 required that these courts now had to be open at both ends. Now what we see here is this court is open at the front here, but that there steps down to the highway to the side, so that's not a barrier or anything. So this is open and that's open. Now, is that starting to look familiar in terms of the theme of our terraced houses? It became economically much more viable for builders to actually build in streets now, not in courts, because they do their maths on it in terms of rental income, floor area, and rather than trying to get 8 houses, then sort of 18, sort of 12 houses and 14 houses further and further apart, it became much more of an economic reason to just build them in rows. And in the Liverpool context, that's how the street, if you like, the terraced street, emerged from that preceding very dense environment. What's happened is the court has been origami-like unfolded into a street, and that's where the terraced street comes from. And the Liverpool authorities were really quite clever, because if they'd implemented this straight away, the landlords would have gone to Manchester or somewhere else to build. By introducing this legislation over a period of perhaps 20 years, a bit at a time, it gradually improved things, but still kept the landlords interested, because you still need landlords. So those, they were very careful to introduce this legislation based on what we today call a business case, I suppose. And this term is really interesting. Before these shapes emerged in plan, there was a minimum requirement to have a 3 feet wide ventilation space at the back. So you've got the back of your terraced house, then a 3 feet minimum gap, and then the wall, the boundary. I think that 3 feet wide space is the origin of the term backyard. I can't demonstrate that, but I'm pretty certain in my own mind that backyard term comes from an early requirement of it to be a minimum of 3 feet wide. So there's lots of stuff in here, and the other requirement as well is that at the rear of the property, unlike the courts that used communal privies and toilets and things and standpipes and everything, there's a minimum requirement of 150 square feet at the back of the property. So you've got your own backyard, and more on that in a moment. And that's the point I just made, really. The privies now became attached to each house, so you had your own toilet rather than having to share those sorts of facilities with the rest of your neighbours. So not long after that, the Wrexham was incorporated, I think, in 1857. So we're now into the second half of the 19th century, and Wrexham implemented their own bylaws, and these are the 1861 bylaws. And of course now you start to have to submit plans, which is the same for today's builders. At this point the authorities require to see what it is you want to do before they give you approval to do it. So this is again a breakdown of how these houses took shape, because under the Wrexham bylaws, and its typical bylaws similar to others in other parts of the UK, it shall not be lawful newly to erect any house or to rebuild any house pulled down without a sufficient water closet or privy and an ash pit, furnished with proper doors and coverings. So we have the house, and we have an ash pit and a privy. Every person who shall erect a new domestic building shall provide in front of such building an open space which shall be free from any erection thereon, except any portico, porch, step, or other like projection, shall, without the whole line of frontage, extend to a distance of 24 feet at the least. You can't build anything in front of your house closer than 24 feet. So we've got that 24 feet requirement. Every person who shall erect a new domestic building shall provide in the rear of such building an open space exclusively belonging to such building and of an aggregate extent of not less than 150 square feet and free from any erection thereon except a water closet, earth closet or privy and an ash pit. So that 150 feet, it has to be exclusive to each house. It can only incorporate an ash pit and a privy, and it has to extend laterally through the entire width of the house and be a minimum of 10 feet deep. Of course, 10 feet by 15 feet is 150 square feet, which is the minimum requirement anyway. So you see the standardization of these minimum requirements now just generating, like builders do today almost, some of them, the minimum. This is only a minimum requirement. So that 15 feet wide house becomes almost a standard terraced house at the lower level of the market. Then we've got other requirements then in terms of the height. If your house is quite tall, if it's 15 feet, then the boundary has to be 15 feet away. If it's 25 feet, and this is typically to half the height of the roof, your boundary has to be 20 feet away. And if it's 35 feet to halfway up the roof, it has to be 25 feet, a minimum distance to the boundary as well. So what you can see is all these regulations and dimensional requirements is now starting to engineer a standard product. And that's why you can go and look at terraced houses all over the UK and they look similar simply because the bylaws are similar. But what this is doing, of course, is when we're looking at height, height is restrictive in terms of light and air. And modern day planners, the first thing they will look at is your proposal in relation to the neighbours, because a lot of this still applies in terms of town planning legislation. So what we've done then with all these dimensions and all these requirements is create an environment where builders they understand what the minimum standard is, and boy do they build millions of them. So when you think about it, inside the house there was a requirement that windows have to be at least 10% of the floor area of the room. So that ensures that a standard box sash sliding window is universal, because if you're talking a 15 feet wide house, which is X feet deep, that will generate a standard size room floor plan, which then generates a standard size window. So we're actually coming into the standardized approach to these buildings. Not only 10% of the window has to be, not only 10% of the floor area of the room has to be window, half of that has to be openable. So again, it's the light and the ventilation that these buildings are now allowing inside. So you get the sliding sash window just is the perfect answer to that legislative requirement. So when it comes to layout, if we lay out a street with the same hand, that phrase hand is sort of, I suppose, built environment engineering term for that way round or that way round, so left hand, right hand. If we have the same hand, in other words, if there's a right hand house in series like that, we create a space where the light and the ventilation is still quite claustrophobic. There's not much circulation around there, but if you lay out your streets to be left, right, you've immediately created a much bigger open space for light and ventilation. So, and that's a good indicator of early terraced houses and later terraced houses. If they're all the same hand, then chances are it might be 1860s, 1850s. If they are left, right, it's probably 1860s, 1870s, 1880s. You can see the differences in that, because there is much more space for that light and air to circulate. So we end up with an engineered product, really, that complies to with the bylaws. And we get a 2 up, 2 down. We might get a 3 up, 2 down. And what is really interesting about some of the terminology here is that this kitchen, the association of cooking with the word kitchen is a relatively modern one. Kitchen to the average Victorian tenant would have been living room in modern terminology. And my mother would always say, we only had one kitchen in our house, my mother would always say, I'm out the back kitchen. We didn't have a front kitchen, so, you know, kitchen would have been good enough. But even into the 1960s and 70s and 80s, that term back kitchen, you know, was still in use. But the origin of that is probably 1840, 1850. My mother used to, you know, she's a bit old-fashioned. She used to sort of keep going in her own sort of way. But that's an interesting word, that word kitchen. So we've got these sort of standard 2 up, 2 down, 3 up, 3 down. But if you could put a bay window on it, you could charge extra rent. And my supervisor at university wrote a lovely paper called A View with a Room, which I thought was really quite clever. Because again, it's about light and it's about air. You've made the window much bigger, which makes that front room much lighter and much, you know, sort of more ventilated and a nicer space to be in. So that'll add a shilling on your rent. These are business people after all, and you know they are using, you know, their skill to accommodate the market. And of course, that social mobility in the Victorian period. That's a really interesting. That's probably another lecture. You know, so I won't sort of spend too much time talking about it now. But this is a time when the rental market accommodated pretty much everybody if they had a job. Now we're in a situation where I'd suggest that modern house builders are not particularly interested in the social housing part of the market. You know, that's left to typically public, semi-public private bodies, charities, third sector maybe, and local authorities to manage that as best they can. These days, in the Victorian period, certainly in the 1870s, 1880s, you know, you could afford your rent if you had a job, more or less. That's quite a sweeping statement. But the market accommodated all the various levels right down to the very poorest, because that's what these houses are for. They are to raise those people out of poverty. So the problem is on the left and the solution is on the right. And that's where the terraced house comes from. It's an engineered, dimensionally directed, regulated product. So now that we've established that this is the momentum of change really in the 19th century, the significance of North Wales to Liverpool, these builders that moved from Liverpool, from North Wales to Liverpool in particular, timed it perfectly to get onto the economy that was opening up in such a significant part of the world. And it's a myth. It's not a myth, it's the wrong word, but people understand that Wales has made a huge contribution to the development of Liverpool. And here are just a few quotes. So the urban development of Victorian Liverpool was different from other Victorian towns and unique in the sense that it was undertaken in the main by Welsh migrants and their families for 200 years, you know, from very early on. As North Wales was a rich source of building materials, enterprise and labour, the linkage between Liverpool and the North Wales region consolidated into one business and a single enterprise. Thomas Roberts has written a few papers on this. And he's right. It was almost a monopoly, quite often orchestrated from the vestry of the Calvinistic Methodist chapel. Particularly Calvinistic Methodists, because they were the biggest sort of movement in Liverpool at the time. And it was a labour exchange as well as a place of faith. And you know that the Welsh community more or less kept it in-house in that respect. And an influx of Welsh builders invaded Messrs Earls Fields in the Edge Hill district about 1863, and in a few years the whole surface north of the railway was covered with houses. James Allinson Picton is a good read. He was a contemporary, I think 1870 something. He published Memorials of Liverpool as a topographical and a historical volume to that. And if you want to get into the streets and to read the environment, they are really two very interesting volumes to read. And Alwyn Morris Jones has done some stats on where these builders came from. And what is interesting about this, the 35% there is typically second generation, but 49% came from Anglesey and Carnarvonshire. Now the reason for that, of course, is that it's much easier to get Liverpool by boat than it is by train or overland at that period. So lots of people moving from an agricultural environment, typically, to Liverpool, who weren't afraid of hard work and graft. When you think about people who had been born and brought up on farms and in agriculture, heavy lifting, long hours, hard work, then they were perfectly suited to the building industry, all before power tools, of course. So I see Victorian builders with big hands. I've got small hands, but you know, that's no surprise that Anglesey and Carnarvonshire contributed so much to Liverpool over the years. And this is a great book. This is The Welsh Builder on Merseyside, Annals and Lives, and this was published in 1946, and that was very timely because this chap just collected stories of Welsh builders at a time when many of the late Victorian Welsh builders were still in the memories of the people that he interviewed. And it's great. It's not particularly academic, it's just a collection of character biographies. And these are some of the people that he mentions: Porky Williams, Wiggy Roberts, John Jones Drinkwater, John Jones Mayfield, Sky John, Australian Williams, Footy Tom, Tom Tom, Honest Tom, which suggests there's a dishonest Tom as well, Right Away Jack, Windy Bob, don't ask, Champion, Nosy Jones, that, well, you know, Bob the Liar, I like him in particular, Yankee Bill, Bill South Africa, Cockney Bill, John Hughes Bach, John Hughes a Cantor, John Jones a Glow, Hughes a Kai, Williams Bach, Williams Caerdegog, Scotch Williams, Mason Jones, Hugh Ponsonby, Owen Fawr, Hugh Fawr, China Davis, the Great Bouncer, the Tramper, Klondike Jones. They're all Welsh builders that are mentioned in that book. And the mark of some of these Welsh builders was very subtle. Some of you, I'm sure, will have seen this before. But if you think about Goodison Park football ground, Everton's home, of course, if you look at the first letter of all the streets up here, we've got Owen and William Owen. And one of the daughters was Eliza, and one of the sons was E. Alfred. Why not? The contractor who built those streets. But of them all, this is the greatest builder ever to have arrived in Liverpool. This is Richard Owens. I call him builder because he was a joiner. He was taught joinery by his father on a farm at Four Crosses on the Llŷn Peninsula, and he left that part of Llŷn to make his fortune in Liverpool, probably in the early 1850s. So some of those Welsh houses he will have carpentered roofs on, but not long after a few years, anyway, I'm nailed down how many years it was, but maybe 4 or 5 years, he then came off the tools to an extent and started working in estate agents and studied at night and qualified as an architect in terms of the qualification of the day. And he did make his fortune. He arrived as perhaps a 19-year-old carpenter joiner, and his probate tells us that he was almost a millionaire by the time he died. Because again, just like many other builders from North Wales, timed it just right. So he is responsible for the design of over 150 chapels in Wales, mostly in Wales, 9 institutional buildings, 12 banks and post offices, 39 schools and Sunday schools, including East Street School, I think it is, in Llangollen. Anybody familiar with that? 53 warehouses and manufactories, 5 office buildings, 10 arbitrations and 2 draft bill consultancies. So he was consulted at the highest level in terms of boundary changes as an expert in the growth and expansion of Liverpool. And of course, being an arbitrator, clearly recognised as knowing his stuff. But most of all, tens of thousands of houses. And what's interesting, I think, is we'll come on to a few sort of other facts in a moment. His obituary suggests that he laid out more land in Liverpool than anybody else. And that, I suppose, was one of my research questions, I suppose. Did he or didn't he? And I was more than pleasantly surprised. I've had the privilege of reading through his archive. That's 17,500 letters. And what I couldn't do was leave you without the flavour of his personality. I beg to call your attention to a plan which I submitted for 2 houses and a ship on in Roseley and Mossley Hill. I'm given to understand that the plan complies with the bylaws in every respect, but that a question has been raised as to fencing an area in the cross street, a question, in my opinion, that you have no right to interfere with. And as I'm anxious to proceed with this work, I shall be glad if you will come to a final decision on the point and pass the plan so that I may proceed with the work. Your attention will oblige. But it gets better. Dear sir, you have too many committees and too many clerks of the works that you replace. The work I saw last Wednesday was done exceedingly well, and I have no reason to think but that all the rest is done the same. But I've kept my favourite till last. This is about a chapel. Sir, your paper The Goliad came to my hand this day by accident, and I find that advertisement for tender to new chapel Llanfair Cyrainion put in a very comical manner, just as you are in the habit of doing. Penmachno Chapel before was done just as strange. You must have a lot of blundering idiots as composers. In this case, Llanfair Cyrainion is put down as Llanfair Fechan, and my name, instead of being Richard Owens, is Richard Davis. And this is not the first time you made this mistake. The very same advertisement was sent to the Oswestry Advertiser, and it appeared quite correct. But yours is the most misleading affair that ever appeared in print. I should fancy that there are so much controversial questions flying around about your office in trying to keep the cash in order that it quite put business matters in obscurity. So he's really not happy, but you get a flavour. I did find one letter which said, yes, it's my fault, and I'll put it right. So, you know, when he made a mistake, he'd sort it out. But this is his housing contribution to Liverpool throughout the 30 years of his career. It is huge. Just this one architect supervising terraced housing schemes. And it totals a massive 325 acres of land set out by a carpenter's son from the Llyn. Amazing achievement. What's interesting as well on this plan is if you look at this bit here, see that bit, that grid of streets, that's early 19th century, and it was set out to be a new Liverpool, just like the new town in Edinburgh. But it didn't happen. The streets were set out, and because of the proximity to the docks, it was immediately filled with slums, or, you know, semi-immediately filled up, and it was too late by then. They couldn't get the Georgian mansions in that part of town because the docks had more or less taken over it. We'll come on to the Welsh streets in a moment. Our time is cracking on, so we'll have a quick flick through some of these slides. But the Welsh streets, that's been in the news quite a lot over the last decade, are located here. Kensington, that is one of only 2 almost complete Victorian estates in the UK. So that's really significant. That's a protected area now. And not only when you look at where the Welsh are in Liverpool, he is actually not just extending Liverpool, he's extending the Welsh community as well, certainly in Everton and in South Liverpool in Toxteth. And this is Stonewall Street. It was under construction when General Stonewall Jackson was killed in the American Civil War. So clearly the landowners had sympathy with the South. And what's interesting about this as well, I find, is that as well as scrubbing the doorsteps, the tenants would scrub the windowsills as well. Because scrubbing the doorstep was a bylaw requirement. As a tenant, you were required to do that. And that's why people today still scrub the flagstones outside their house, because it was a bylaw requirement for so long. So in terms of the process, when people migrated not wanting to live in such a densely populated town anymore, then streets were just built on their land and they sold up within the boundaries. Streets were fitted, and when you look at a typical project of Richard Owens's, it's no surprise that we've got J&R Williams, Susan Williams, Peter Davis, Thomas Jones and Moses Evans all building houses there. Not a surprise at all, and that just aggregated, and therefore you can still see the medieval plan in the streets. These are all demolished now, but you could then sort of see how these were parcelled up and sold off as individual plots, if you like. And what's interesting about going through the archive is that everything is in sequence. So for the first time in 150 years, we can create the order in which these streets were built. That estate was clearly started off at the north and ventured further south. And what amazes me is how little paperwork Victorian builders needed to build houses. Now it's like most projects are like building another runway at Manchester Airport, you know, the paperwork that you need. But these are builders who know what they're doing. You know, they can be relied upon because of that sort of cohesion within the Welsh community in many respects. And we build a corner shop first, and we build a corner pub second, and then we build all the houses in between because we've got about 18 months worth of hungry and thirsty builders. And from Wales, which is even better because they're going to be hungrier and thirstier perhaps. So they weren't daft, they were very commercially aware. And as a good Calvinistic Methodist, Richard Owens was pretty broad-minded because he built as many pubs as he did chapels. So what's interesting about the Victorian economy, if you like, though, in these terraced houses, is that there was room for everybody. Right? You can probably count modern volume house builders on the digits of one hand. They've cornered the market, that sort of top-level housing market. But in the Victorian periods, we look at these streets now and we see them as a whole, but they weren't constructed like that. They were sold off by length of frontage. So if you were a start-up and you wanted to start building houses as a business at the lowest level, you could buy one length of frontage and build one house. If you're a medium enterprise in modern day terms, you could be a Jones and Daughters or a Mr. Davis. And if you were a regular building company, you could buy as much as you think you could afford to build for profit. And that is quite often evidenced by the join. It's the same street, they're the same type of houses, but the materials are different. So in an example like this could be by Jones and Daughters, this could be by Mr. Davis, but we don't read the street like that. So next time you walk along a terrace street from one end to the other, just have a look at the material detail, because that demarcates the different companies that actually built them. So these are Richard Owens's large estates in Toxteth, huge, significant development, and they are 1,900 houses in one estate. And some images of those estates. You can see the standard product. These are quite posh because they've got bay windows. These are some of the Welsh streets, Foylas Street, which was almost demolished until we managed to save them through a public inquiry. And we see, certainly towards the top of this image, you know, how that looks from a bird's eye view. And we're lucky that these houses survive because they're now completely refurbished and are still being refurbished. I think they're due to finish sometime this year. These are the Welsh streets. And what they've done, after the local authority wanted to demolish them all, demolish nearly all of them, they've kept the frontages and put a brand new house on the back of the frontage. So you're getting the best of modern technology in interiors, combined with a very well-established, Welsh-connected elevational frontage to all these streets. And I don't usually creep up to people's houses and take photographs through the front windows, but this was an empty property at the time before the tenants had moved in. And I think this picture captures both requirements of modern society, connections with the past and a significant Welsh connection in the context of Liverpool, and an efficient, warm, high-spec house to live within. And these are great. These are, I was sort of consulted on this to an extent. It's great. This is a milestone for me. It's great to see Richard Owens on the mural, along with other greats like Hilda Ogden, Arthur Askey and George Melly. So Richard Owens. They're all associated with the Welsh streets in Toxteth. They all perhaps were born there, lived there, died there. All locals to that part of Liverpool. And it's great to see a carpenter's lad from Carnarvonshire there as well. And there's a great blue plaque on there. That's my favourite blue plaque in the country. Nan Reaney is the best nan on earth. Best roast dinners, best egg on toast, super gran lives here. That's what blue plaque should be about. So coming to Wrexham then, we now know what a terraced house looks like in 1872. We can see where these estates are. And it's all speculative, of course. It's a private enterprise for rent and for profit. So you can see that these are radial around the town, though. They're not now similar to Liverpool expanding on its frontier. Wrexham, these are new houses to spec out in the fields at this stage. So we see them, the blocks, as they get towards the close of the 19th century and sort of into the Edwardian period. It's interesting, red brick, okay, we think of red brick Victorian houses, but chances are red brick houses are actually Edwardian, not Victorian, because that, that material was a late 19th century, early 20th century material. Before then, the terraced houses were built of more like common brick, which wasn't the dense red bricks. And then towards the First World War, we have things like patches of render turning up. So you can differentiate between, a few decades worth of these houses around the town. So that when we look at 1872, 1898 again with some of the other peripheral developments of terraced houses, we can see that just like some biological organism under a microscope, it expands in particular ways. You wouldn't find terraced houses to those specifications in this part of town because, of course, that's the evolutionary process in 2 dimensions. It is like an organism. And just around some of these places, the quality of the workmanship is fantastic. We look at how these things have been put together without power tools, all with controlled brute force, big forearms and hands, I suspect, big shoulders. Certainly the joiners and the bricklayers. We are blessed with houses like this in Wrexham. The workmanship is fantastic. That's such a simple detail. That's the same brick, just turned upside down every other brick. So in terms of the quality, the detailing and the craftsmanship is fantastic. That's my favourite street, really, I think, Trevor Street. And we get polychromatic designs coming in and nice sort of catalogue picked dentil courses and things.
Were these houses that
Sorry, got to. No, don't worry. Yeah, of course.
Are these houses also rented?
Yes, they were built to rent predominantly. So yeah, and as we suggested, rental at prices that were affordable if you were in work. If you weren't in work, you might have a bit of a problem, but the rental market went right down to the very bottom, really, in that respect. And that's an important point, actually. The builder would build the street or the part of the street and then sort of generate income from the rental income. So they're mostly speculative, but what I'd advise you to do next time you're in any urban environment like this in the UK is forget about the UPVC front doors, or the UPVC front door windows and screens and things. Just have a look at the brickwork. It is a tapestry of colour, texture, and I'm sure that there is something in there for somebody to produce in terms of a piece of artwork, whether it's a fabric, whether it ends up being a tea towel, I don't know. The brickwork of Wrexham, it's such a rich environment, being the centre of the brick world, of course, in terms of Rhiwabon and places. So that's the terraced house, and we know that these are extortionate prices, purely at market value. a million miles from their intended purpose. But to finish, I'd just like to bring you back to something that we looked at earlier on, and I want you to focus opposite Crown Buildings up here on this little entranceway there and the destitute courts that existed behind it. Because when you walk around town, sometimes there are anomalies and you see openings and doorways that shouldn't really be there. And I found this one, and I've located it on the OS map. And through that doorway, a century and a half ago, was desperate poverty and disease. Thank you very much.